Hello.
Our story begins inside of a shuttle speeding through Coruscant's atmosphere. The Imperial capital was glistening with light. The celestial body that this city world orbited reflected off the windows of the glass city. Krennic's personal shuttle breezed past buildings and landed softly on the landing docks of the Imperial Palace. It had been a long journey, especially since the detonation of Jedha City. Lord Vader was out on a different mission, working on behalf of the Emperor, and Krennic was assigned to return to Coruscant so that he could have his audience with Palpatine himself. The Imperial director stepped out of his shuttle, flanked by his elite death troopers. His white cape fluttered on the ground behind him as a swift breeze lifted the cape and sent it waving as Krennic himself walked closer to the doors leading into the palace. When he actually got inside, he was greeted by an individual who led him all the way down to the throne room, where the Emperor was currently residing. Krennic's thoughts on his way to this location within the palace were rampant. He didn't know what his liege had in store for him, but he believed he should be optimistic. Project Stardust was a success. The weapon was in perfect condition. The ancient city was destroyed, the rebels silenced, and even further, following his short stint at Edo, he had confirmed the death of the treacherous scientist Galen Erso. Krennic twisted his cufflinks to appear perfectly placed. He stretched his shoulders and planted his back as straight as he could. His eyes fixated on the throne, which wasn't facing them. As they walked down into the main chamber, the man who greeted him bowed, addressed the Emperor, and turned around, quickly leaving the room. The death troopers were told to wait at the landing platform, so the only ones inside of Palpatine's throne were himself, Krennic, and the scattered royal guards, who stood at attention. Sidious's chair slid around, and it faced the Imperial director, who held his breath. Sidious clasped his hands together and greeted Krennic, having not seen him in quite some time. He asked about the decision to target Jedha City, and if he understood what it meant for the wider empire. Director Krennic nodded his head, explaining that Grand Moff Tarkin requested an audience with him, desiring to see the remarkable power of the superstation. Due to its completion and his role as Director of Operations, he willingly proceeded. Krennic held his words though. As much as he would like to direct blame at Tarkin or try and promote himself as the Imperial worthy of control over the superstation, interacting with Palpatine was a vastly different experience, especially compared to speaking with his henchmen. For Imperial officers like Krennic, talking to Palpatine was a terrifying experience. He was a smaller man, who spoke softly, shortly, and hypnotically. His eyes were golden, and yet when they locked eyes, it felt like the Emperor could see straight through him. Palpatine's aura was indescribable. No one could compare to him. This wasn't just the power of loyalty. It was the strength of the dark side of the Force. Sidious fed off their fear, and he used it to reveal their deepest desires without even having to ask for them. Sidious addressed Jedha City first, remarking that it had created a disturbance within the halls of the Senate. He had to personally inform them that the ancient city had been destroyed in a mining accident. Sidious smiled as he rose from his chair, explaining that no mining incident in galactic history looked as hard as what had happened at Jedha. The planet was split nearly into two, with massive chunks of debris floating around the system like an asteroid belt. He walked over to the window and told Krennic that his decision to destroy the ancient city was rightly placed, yet it was wrongly operated. There were more efficient methods of silencing the rebels, especially those like Saw Gerrera. Krennic nodded his head in the background. The Emperor turned back and told him that to control a weapon like the Death Star was not like using an Imperial Star Destroyer. It was a super weapon, unlike anything seen in galactic history, and if there were to be one in control of it, they needed to be calculated. Yet their influence could not be so widespread. Orson wasn't following, but there was a clear point Palpatine was preparing to make. The Dark Lord had become quite aware of Tarkin's growing influence in the years since the construction of Palpatine's Imperial regime. It was only a matter of time until someone like Tarkin could grow beyond the role of Grand Moff. And if they could grow beyond it, then their jealousy of the one above them would fuel their desires to seize the day. Palpatine had no intention of allowing his longtime friend the opportunity to take control over his own destiny. Sidious finally, after moments of silence, spoke up. He told Director Krennic that he wanted him to be completely honest and transparent with him. Orson nodded his head, expressing that he would no matter what, and Sidious just chuckled to himself. No, there was a question that he wanted to have answered. He moved back around to the question, just as he stopped and stared in Orson's direction. He asked Krennic, what was the Death Star? What did it represent? Director Krennic had seen this project in its most infantile form. This was his and Galen's child. They created the ultimate power in the galaxy, and now, what did it mean for its use? Orson looked at Palpatine as the question ran through his mind. A smile formed on his face, telling the Emperor that the Death Star served as a reminder of Imperial strength. Its purpose was not for mere use, but as a symbol of the untouchable regime the Emperor had created. Jedha was a simple exercise, but the proof of what was done there was what all systems needed to see to know that they couldn't rise above Imperial rule. Stardust was an instrument of peace, not of war. It was the deciding factor of who joined the insurgents and who signed up for the Academy. Krennic smiled, with a little laugh in his voice, because they both know what joining the Imperial Academy meant. Just a little propaganda to radicalize the young minds who desired service. He finished, telling Palpatine that Stardust was the destruction of the Alliance, new and old. It was the beginning of the new golden age of Imperial rule. Sidious wasn't one for flattery, because it literally didn't mean anything to him. But this right here was a perfectly executed understanding of what the Death Star was created for. He considered the prospect of giving the reins of the super weapon over to Tarkin, but his continued political growth and support in recent years proved that he could become a rival. Sidious didn't need someone within the Empire disrupting that stability. Also, not for nothing, there was a worry that Palpatine had. He sensed a great disturbance, one in which he believed his former friend would get a little too arrogant. In this arrogance, he believed that Tarkin would do something erratic. Sidious didn't know what, but the Force was warning him. His constant daily rituals warned of an action that would put his empire in danger. Sidious planned on dismantling the Senate anyways, so it wouldn't come from there, and at this current moment he believed that it had to be Tarkin. He smiled warmly at Krennic and told him that the operation of the Death Star belonged to him. His words and understanding of the weapon had convinced him of that much. However, there was something he would need to do before taking control over the weapon. Tarkin would need to be removed from power, and Krennic's sole objective was to secure the loose-end Imperial pilot and make sure the Rebel Alliance didn't get control over the plans for the weapon. Sidious also never specifically told Krennic where to park it. He assumed that Orson would do something that would elongate his stay as director of the station, or perhaps he would be the erratic misstep he assumed Tarkin would be. For the time being, though, he was willing to put this trust into Krennic. There were multiple reasons for this. Among them were already listed fears of Tarkin's continuous political growth. He was a popular face amongst Imperials, and he had simply reached the top. The only other place he could go was Vizier, which wouldn't exist in the Senate much longer, or Emperor, and Palpatine wasn't giving up his role. Someone like Krennic is what Sidious needed. He was comparable to a rabid cur. He understood his role. He was loyal to a fault, and that's what Palpatine needed. Krennic was someone that could be manipulated, because he wanted to serve, but on his conditions. Those conditions were the Death Star under his control. This wasn't to say that Palpatine was afraid of Orson. Rather, he was doing some short-term bargaining with the best option. If Krennic proved himself worthy, then good. If not, then he'd be replaced as well. Just as Sidious predicted, though, Orson would be overwhelmingly pleased with his appointment. Krennic didn't have higher aspirations than the Death Star. He cared about the project because he fought so hard to garner funding for it to begin with. He wanted the Death Star to see the light of day, and now because of his dedication it was here. Krennic's issues stemmed from Tarkin just taking his role as the administrator of the station. With Palpatine's blessing, he would remain loyal to the Emperor, because first and foremost, that's where his allegiance was laid. Krennic's shuttle quickly moved across the galaxy, where he would eventually find himself inside the Death Star. His personal guard followed him through the facilities into the administrative hallways. He bypassed troopers, officers, members of the ISB, financial advisors, and so forth. All of these individuals ran the behind-the-scenes work for the Imperial military. Tarkin was sitting snug inside of his office, and Krennic's boots marched to the hum of his own beat. He had permission and purpose. He was the director of Stardust. He was the creator of this technological terror, and not Tarkin, nor Vader, nor any other Imperial would dare take it from him. He stepped up to the administrative door, and he knocked pleasantly. The doors opened, as the 4 Death Troopers stood guard on either side of the 2 Stormtroopers standing guard. Krennic stepped in, and Tarkin looked up pleasantly, seeing that Orson had come crawling back. Instead of a short burst of conversation, Krennic stood in the doorway, pulled his blaster, and fired it straight through Tarkin's chest. The wound dropped him out of his chair. His head smacked the Venator model planted behind his desk, and it fell on top of his dead body. The two other troopers standing guard reacted, until they were lifted off the ground and killed with a snap of their necks. An Imperial trooper walking around the corridor of the hallway saw this. One of the Death Troopers placed a finger to his helmet and shook his head, and the Imperial trooper nodded and turned away, acting like he hadn't seen a thing because nothing happened. Krennic would stand over Tarkin in gloating fashion, enjoying the pride of his kill. It had been a long time since he specifically killed anyone, but it felt good. Krennic kicked the Venator model, calling Tarkin an old fool. That ancient dinosaur was about to be replaced again. No need for relics of the past. The Death Troopers would dispose of the two guards and Tarkin by throwing them into the trash compactor, as Director Krennic returned to the command center to announce he was given control over the Death Star, thanks to the Emperor's orders. There was some hesitancy, but he was able to prove it. Unluckily for him, he was informed of a data breach at Scarif. The rebels were attacking the facility. Krennic told the crew to prepare single ignition reactors, and he ordered a superstation to Scarif immediately. Due to his time away from Mustafar and Vader's castle, he wasn't given orders to go to Scarif to make sure everything was cleared up. There was some sort of hole in the Death Star, and they needed to figure out how to clean it up. Palpatine wasn't as concerned with these little intricacies, because these were things Krennic needed to figure out for himself. The little trip to Coruscant had simply taken too much time, that he needed to bounce to the Imperial base at Scarif to help the Empire clean things up. When the Death Star eventually arrived, the battle at the Imperial planet was going swimmingly for the Alliance. Admiral Raddus had countered the Star Destroyers protecting the shield gate perfectly, and the Death Star plans had been transmitted up to the profundity. Instead of targeting the base on the surface, Krennic decided to target something else. The reactor core on the Death Star had been designed to hit stationary objects, but with Lord Vader's arrival and the destruction of Alliance frigates and support ships, Krennic decided that the Mon Cala warship needed to be obliterated. There was no shot the rebels could send a transmission further away from the system, due to all communications being blocked. Krennic ordered the single reactor ignition to target the Mon Cala vessel, and the shot that fired shocked Darth Vader. He wasn't very pleased either. His shuttle was heading directly towards the ship, and he almost got eviscerated. He was not happy to say the least, but instead of paying the rebels inside the vessel a visit, his landing sequence would be saved for the surface of the planet. Scarif's defenses had held strong, but the rebel freedom fighters had truly won the ground battle. They didn't win because of numbers, they simply got the Death Star plans off the surface. But with Krennic deciding the best move was to remove the head of the snake from Scarif, the ground victory was an ultimate loss. Cassian Andor and Jyn Erso would be captured by Vader's landing party, along with a couple other rebels who survived the fighting on the surface. They would be handled by Vader as he tried to sniff out answers leading back to the rebel base. He was furious with the operatives inside the Death Star for their actions over the planet, but he couldn't exactly remove them from their power. His captain never communicated that there was going to be a boarding sequence, and Krennic assumed no one would go inside, judging by the broadside the Profundity was taking from the Devastator. It was a goofy event all around, but Krennic had other incentives to take advantage of. Due to the fact that the superstation was meant to remain a secret, he moved it away from any other system and placed it outside of a random star in the Inner Rim. They had to obviously hyperspace their way there, but in Krennic's mind, there wasn't any other need for the weapon for the time being. He had to wait until Palpatine gave him new orders. Krennic's decision to destroy the Rebel flagship wouldn't just kill off the Rebel Admiral, but Leia Organa, the Death Star plans, C-3PO, and R2-D2. These heroes of the rebellion were integral for getting the ball rolling for the next leg of Alliance operations, and with the actual Alliance pretty much disbanding before Scarif, Mon Mothma was stuck in this weird predicament, where she needed to gather forces after their loss at Scarif. The worst part is, the Death Star plans that Jyn and Cassian had transmitted to the Profundity were still inside the Spire at Scarif. Someone could still go to that planet and steal the plans. The shield gate was down, and the Empire only had one vessel over the planet, which was Vader's flagship, as they waited for various reinforcements from around the Outer Rim to gather up. It was an easy strike, but the demoralized Rebel Alliance wouldn't be able to gather the forces necessary or willing enough to head back to Scarif. Shame too, because Vader was elbows deep in interrogations with the survivors of the ground attack. Krennic would report his dealings to the Emperor, who was actually pretty pleased. The Imperial Director was mostly contacting Palpatine because he wanted to know what his next orders were. Sidious didn't have any in mind. His main focus at the moment was the disbanding of the Imperial Senate, but he was given an idea, which Sidious listened to. He actually liked the idea quite a lot, and requested that before the disbanding of the Senate, that the Death Star make an appearance at Coruscant. It would take forever to lug the superweapon all the way from the outer rim to the inner rim to the core. When it actually arrived over the capital, people on the surface were overwhelmed with fear. What was that? Had their empire constructed a moon-sized space station? As the Death Star made its first intentional public appearance, Sidious addressed the galaxy, informing the populace that the rancid Rebel Alliance had been defeated outside the Outer Rim Abrion sector. Their largest fleet recorded to date was defeated with the assistance of one Star Destroyer and the superweapon called Stardust. He informed them all that there was no reason to fear, because he and the newly appointed Administrative Director, Orson Krennic, held full control over the weapon. He explained that this was the brainchild of the Senate in the Old Republic, shortly before the end of the Clone War. Palpatine went further to explain that he stood against the idea of a planetary-sized weapon, like this. He then told the story about how the Senate had gone behind his back, planted Grand Moff Tarkin as its administrator, and then targeted the ancient city on Jedha. These shortcomings were all dealt with. Tarkin was handled as any traitor should be, and here, on this day, Sidious was announcing that the Imperial Senate was disbanded. Their desire to embezzle Imperial funds meant for the population was disheartening and disgusting. Sidious confessed that he always tried to provide the best empire to the people, and the Senate stood against him in every possible way. They were all to lose their jobs as representatives and face repercussions for their acts of treason, just like Grand Moff Tarkin. He then continued further. While he didn't agree with their decision to create this technological terror they called the Death Star, he decided that it'd be a waste of Imperial funds to try and destroy it now. Palpatine encouraged people to join the Imperial military, as this new superstation, he was calling Stardust, would require millions of workers. He provided a reason for the populace to believe that he was again the victim, but he was making the best out of a bad situation. He encouraged the population to join the Imperial military so that they could travel the galaxy and bring order to the Empire. His speech about Stardust would inspire the populace of the core, especially to see enlistment numbers soar. People saw this weapon as a station of peace. It was like Starlight of the High Republic, yet it had defenses, and it could pose a significant threat against insurgents like the Rebel Alliance. With Palpatine announcing the dismantling of the rebels over Scarif, the Alliance fled from their hidden bases and went even deeper into hiding. This allowed Krennic and Palpatine more time to plan how they wanted to take the fight to the rebellion. Their enemies were going to be even harder to try and find. And what did that mean for the Empire? It meant that they needed to continue to extinguish the hope of the Alliance. The reaction to Stardust and Scarif only made the Emperor feel even more confident in his decision to appoint Krennic as the administrator of the superweapon. Everything was going as he had foreseen. For the following few years, the status quo would be maintained. The effectiveness of the Death Star couldn't be overstated. It completely shut down the fight for the rebels. Without the Death Star plans ever finding their way to Tatooine, there would be no new rebel fighters. While his twin sibling was dead, Luke Skywalker was actually a part of the Imperial Navy, though his position within it was not out of his personal choosing. Due to the Senate being disbanded and the senators executed for high treason, Bail Organa sent out a message before his death to Ben Kenobi. The Jedi Hermit was instructed to save the rebellion, so he rose from his little shack and went to find Owen and Beru. The aunt and uncle of Luke Skywalker stood their case again. He would not train as a Jedi, but Obi-Wan became persistent. So, in spite of the Jedi Master, in full belief that the Empire would give Luke more opportunities, Owen and Beru used whatever credits they could muster and sent their adopted son off to the academy that he wanted to get to. Luke obviously didn't care about the Empire. He was just trying to find Biggs and join up with the rebellion or find some other adventure. Instead, Luke was brought into the academy and tipped off the Emperor, almost immediately. With Vader still pissed about Scarif, Sidious decided to put Luke under Director Krennic. There was a reason this would work perfectly. Following the public revelation of Stardust, Vader would try and kill Orson in front of Palpatine. Krennic was a little traumatized, but the Sith apprentice was electrocuted for his brash behavior. They were barred from ever being near each other again, which mostly affected Vader, because Krennic didn't do anything wrong. He was the Imperial officer who did a lot right, quite frankly. So when a couple weeks after the incident, Sidious was alerted that a Luke Skywalker with an M count of above 19,000 joined the Imperial Academy, he knew what to do. On the day that Skywalker planned on mutinying, he was picked up and brought across the stars. Sidious actually planned on training Luke, due to the fact that he had to be Anakin's son. Also, the DNA proved that he actually was. But Luke was too free-minded, like Anakin at his age. So Palpatine needed Krennic to break him down, turn young Skywalker into a cold, calculated cadet that could work for the Empire as a true loyalist, one bred from the Outer Rim. When Luke's transformation into an assertive Imperial officer who knew his place was complete, Sidious would begin training him. The purpose of this operation was to break Luke down and build him up as a cog of the Imperial machine, only for him to then find purpose as a Sith apprentice. It was a very simple addition to the basics of Imperial training regiments. Luke didn't want to be on the Death Star, but he enjoyed being around someone like Krennic. The director didn't know why Luke was placed as his underling, but he was willing to accept it. Skywalker was simply too young to replace him now, or even in the next 10 to 15 years, which was fine with Orson. As long as Krennic could retire with a surplus of credits, he didn't care what Luke did. Perhaps he was to be the future replacement, but being that Krennic got what he wanted, he enjoyed multiple years as director of Stardust. He simply couldn't care what happened after he stepped down. He had done his job. Luke and Orson had a weird dynamic though. They got along fine, but neither really liked or disliked the other. Krennic was kind to Luke because he understood what it was like to shadow an Imperial officer, but this didn't mean he was soft. Luke was to follow orders to a T, which is exactly what he did. Aside from these minute details within Imperial ranks, the galactic picture was much different. The Alliance hadn't truly been seen. They were led by General Syndulla by this point, because Mon Mothma was captured in a battle far off the Rishi Maze and killed. It was a complete accident that they were even found, but some pirates wanted money and the Empire had millions to spare, so they got screwed over. Syndulla placed the remnants of the rebellion on Ashen Cloths to keep them hidden away in a dense jungle. The base was secluded and they were able to continue gaining fighters, but hope was dwindling. Stardust struck absolute fear into the galaxy, and the crazy thing is, it hadn't even used its super weapon since Scarif. There was no need for it, and that alone showed the desperation of the Alliance. Hera was struggling with the rebel fighters, but there was always hope and she reminded her fighters of that as often as she could. The rebels were able to gain a following in the Outer Rim like they did before Scarif, but it was impossible to grow anything within the Mid-Rim, Inner Rim, and especially in the core. Yet, despite these struggles for the rebels, there was something else assisting them. The capital, Coruscant, was having its own problems. Local government officials, after the fall of the Senate, used the power gap intentionally, created by Palpatine, to continue burying districts. Coruscant had seen more growth in the last 4 years or so than it had seen in the last several decades. The purpose for this growth was to bury citizens who were not welcome within the rest of the high-rise populace. This completely cut off an entire subsection of the population from luxuries they once had, and when they were thrown in with the rest of the underworld, no longer permitted to see the glory of Coruscant's sun, a problem arose. The people were able to rally together movements, and on the far side of the planet, these problems manifested. A lot of these Coruscant protests and riots wouldn't take form inside the actual capital of the Ecumenopolis. This wasn't near the senatorial district, nor the classic government buildings, or even near the Imperial Palace. The growing resistance formed on the exact opposite side of the planet, meaning the actual core group of elites on the planet weren't directly affected. This move by the local government was to subsidize housing, while also buying it all up. So these new towers and skyscrapers and new levels of construction weren't able to be owned by individuals. They were bought by private investors, elites, and people within Coruscant's government itself, and they jacked up the prices. Those who had the luxury of being topside before they were built, on top of, couldn't continue moving up in the world, and their own prices increased as is, forcing them away and further down. Those who were actually able to move in were wealthy investors from the core, who bought up the spaces for all their buddies in their circles. New centers of investment and finance were smacked right down in the middle of these new financial districts, as the people who built them withered in the underworld. This was something too micro for Palpatine to pay attention to, because Masameda usually worked on behalf of him with the local government on Coruscant. Krennic didn't know or care about this because he was a military man, and his job was maintaining the operation of a moon-sized space station. So when the pressure bubbled to a head, the two Imperials were incredibly surprised. It was very reminiscent of Ferrix, but multiplied by millions if not billions. The Imperial Guard was sent to handle it, and destroy Resistance fighters, but many of these military men didn't realize that they were sent in to put down their own families, and perhaps that was the cruelest joke of all. After all of their training, their enemies weren't pirates, scum, greedy syndicates, or rebels. They were family members, friends, schoolmates, or even workmates for those who had joined the military as adults. Months of trying to publicly suppress this movement would deteriorate Imperial morale across the galaxy. People who were impressed or afraid of Stardust now saw its true purpose. It lurked over the planet of Coruscant, and Luke, alongside Director Krennic, watched from above as the people tried to get their homes back. Sidious, after months had gone by with no true change in these riots and protests, had requested that Krennic pull a little Jedha, and just for his own safety, the Emperor, his vizier Masameda, and all other important Imperial and financial personnel were evacuated from the planet. Most of them hid in the Death Star. As Stardust wheeled around for a blast in the capital to annihilate the populace trying to rise up and remind the galaxy what the weapon was capable of, another weapon was heading for the command center on the Death Star. Vader had recently learned that there was a secret floating about inside of his master's ranks. He, by accident, learned that Lieutenant Skywalker on the Death Star command staff had been an excellent company as of late. This led to Vader doing a deep dive into a secret that Palpatine had so meticulously covered up. The worst part is, the only reason Vader knew about any of this was because he accidentally overheard a conversation. He was walking by some officers on the bridge of his destroyer, and they were talking about Stardust, as one of the men had recently transferred back into fleet movements due to a desire to see more of the galaxy while protecting the Empire. Vader was first going to kill Krennic, then his master, and then find his son. He walked with fury down the corridors of the super weapon. When he breached the doors of the command center, nearly 100 officers were gathered around, as Krennic gave the order to fire a single reactor ignition. A green light beamed out of the super weapon and slammed down into the surface of Coruscant, shredding past dozens to hundreds to thousands of layers of city and people. They all watched from above, taking in the awesome power of the super station. A few claps arose as Sidious and Krennic, in the front, stood in awe and in pride. Luke was also in the command room, standing right next to Orson, as he covered his mouth in shock. He couldn't believe what he had seen. He knew what the station was, but he didn't fully realize what it was capable of. On the screen, as he continued to watch, an indicator of how many people were presumed dead in the blast continued ticking up. Within the first few seconds, it was already about 10 million. Each second, millions more, and Luke's stomach sank further. He couldn't believe it. His mind turned deaf. He didn't even realize there was a commotion taking place behind him, as his father marched into the room, igniting a lightsaber and slashing down Palpatine's royal guards by the entrance. Luke's eyes maintained their stunned focus on the indicator, pushing past 100 million, and still rising with no slowdown. Sidious reacted to Vader, who lobbed men from their feet with the Force, before dragging his saber into a few of their unlucky bodies. Krennic turned back, firing his pistol to defend himself. Darth blocked these shots as they clipped Orson's shoulders and launched him from his feet. He looked up, as from his peripherals, he could see a motionless Luke, and a movement-filled Sidious who fired electricity at Vader. The Sith apprentice blocked with his saber, but it didn't stop the Sith sorcery from piercing his armor and obliterating him. Vader fell to his knees and wheezed in pain, as Sidious called him out for his lack of faith. His decision to return with such hostility would be the last mistake he ever made. As he continued to blast his student, more royal guards from around the room activated, stabbing their pikes into his sides, and forcing him to cry out in agony. All the while, Vader's son was just mere feet away from him, stuck in time. Orson wanted to be pissed off at Luke, but honestly, he was gonna make sure Vader paid for this, especially after he got his shoulders checked out. Luke continued to watch the number cross billions of people, before settling in on a soft 57 billion presumed deaths in the blast. It was such an unimaginable number, because Tatooine didn't even have a populace more than 1 million people. He just watched as his heart broke in his chest. One of the other officers who quite enjoyed Luke's company ushered him away from the site of the tear in Coruscant. The galaxy, like Luke, reacted with stillness. No one knew what to do. Not the people, the Empire, the rebels, no one. It was one of the worst events ever seen in galactic history, if not the worst. Obi-Wan was still looking for other Jedi, and he felt it. He hoped that Luke, wherever he was safe. But truthfully speaking, he was not. Luke was physically safe, but he wasn't safe from himself. In the years since Scarif, the hole that Galen Erso left behind was found and plugged, stopping the rebels from ever making a strike, which they never did anyways. The Empire, also with a fully operational Death Star, never started construction on another. Palpatine had plans for Starkiller, but that was a little too far advanced for what he needed at the moment. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to build something so large. But Luke had the burden of 57 billion lives on his heart. He was radicalized by Imperial propaganda and Orson Krennic, and even a few meetings with Palpatine. Now, they were all going to pay. While Vader was facing the harshest death imaginable dozens of floors away, Luke was rushing through the halls of the Death Star, his heart fixated on one resolution. Due to his position with Krennic, and Orson not fully understanding why Sidious wanted Luke here, the young lieutenant knew everything he needed to know about this superstation. As he found the reactor room, he caught his breath before slipping around the corner. The deck officers and gunners in the room all looked to him with happiness. They all loved Luke. He was a good guy to eat lunch or dinner with. One of the guys, you know? But young Skywalker pulled a pistol from his belt and started shooting. The gunners were unarmed, and the only officer in there with a weapon was killed first. Luke's blood rushed through his body with anticipation, in fury and confusion, and before he could actually collect himself from what he had seen, from what he had assisted in, he tapped into the control panel. He flipped switches, toggled buttons, reset the mainframe before finally plugging keys into the station itself. He twisted them one at a time before pulling levers across the room. When he came back, he looked towards the core of the station. He had seen this core like a light of hope. Now it felt like nothing but a black hole. Luke's eyes closed, and his hand slammed down on the ignition switch. Instead of firing a blast outwards, the reactor on the Death Star triggered what it thought was a blast to hit a planetary body, but instead it switched inwards, detonating the Kyber crystal and exploding. Sidious, Vader, Krennic, and Luke were swallowed whole by an explosion that ripped the Death Star to pieces. Owen and Beru would learn of their nephew's death when his letters and checks stopped coming in. Luke never told them where he was in fear that Kenobi might follow him, but Luke had more than paid for their moisture farm and given his aunt and uncle financial freedom, because he didn't need the money. His actions in desperation liberated the galaxy from the Imperial occupation that enslaved the minds of the oppressed. The shredding of Coruscant's surface and the death of a fifth of the planet's population would radicalize the galaxy, just like it did Luke. Skywalker's sacrifice wouldn't ever be known, and no one would understand why Stardust detonated over the planet. People would assume it was a collision with pieces of Coruscant, but it started a folklore regarding the potential reality of some hero that saved the galaxy from the superweapon. Regardless, the rebellion mobilized, and a second statement by the Alliance would be made. It wouldn't be as large of a battle as Scarif, but their forces smashed an Imperial data spire, and overwhelmingly won. The Empire was scatterbrained, and they tried to react, but the downfall of the evil regime would come from the least expected enemy. Thanks in part to the Empire's domination of the galaxy, Sidious got too comfortable and he wanted to expand to other galaxies, and Morgan Elsbeth had proposed another idea. Her TIE defenders never truly saw the light of day, despite Thrawn's perfection of the design, but she designed a multi-engine vessel that could travel between galaxies, like the Purrgil. In the return of Ezra Bridger and Grand Admiral Thrawn, only 6 months following the desolation of Coruscant and Imperial leadership, would be more confusion. Thrawn saved the Night Sisters by returning the Great Mothers and their buried dead, but he, instead of aligning with the Empire, would decide to assist General Syndulla. They may have been rivals, but once he rejoined Imperial ranks and learned what Palpatine had apparently ordered, he couldn't stand for it. Not to mention, these Imperial warlords were trying to create another Death Star. The biggest reason Thrawn betrayed the Empire at the end of the day was because of Coruscant. He didn't care for the innocents. He was cold and calculated, and he most certainly wasn't above using civilians as target practice. But he killed with reason. The deaths of the truly confirmed number of 64 billion was unnecessary. And again, like it was before he was taken away from the galaxy, the Empire refused to learn by building bigger. Defeating the Alliance needed to come with weapons like the TIE Defender, and because the warlords refused to listen to his advice, as they continued losing more battles, he decided that the true order would come from the rebellion. Maybe it wasn't the right choice, but he couldn't legitimately stand for the actions caused by his emperor and the regime. They weren't maintaining order, they were establishing more chaos, which the galaxy truthfully didn't need. Thrawn almost left the galaxy altogether, but he'd rather leave the known galaxy with a satisfying conclusion. General Syndulla and Admirals Thrawn and Akbar would be the heroes who restored the Republic. When the war was over, Thrawn left with a warning, reminding Syndulla, Akbar, and the New Republic to always stay mobilized and prepared. Thrawn's warnings would inspire the direction of the New Republic following the destruction of the Imperial warlords. Hera wouldn't take the mantle of Chancellor, but the one who did would be completely new, an individual ready to make the changes necessary to fix and save the galaxy. An individual from Coruscant, actually. Luke's sacrifice at the end of the day would be mythologized as the unsung hero, an individual who put it all on the line for the rest of the galaxy. His name wouldn't ever be known, but it would be his actions that were synonymous with the change the galaxy would see. Obi-Wan's new Jedi Order would wither away after a generation or two, but the Sith would never return, and the New Republic would establish the pathway forward in a galaxy determined for change. And that, my friends, is our story. And special thanks to the patrons: Andrew Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Jack Silver, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Schmoobs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Django Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Grandy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Colin Rooney, Shark McDory, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo670, Annika Snake Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Saints of Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calig, Youngly66, Batman Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Photos Lazy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, The Man with Three First Names, Darkseid46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. Crazy bait and switch there. I really had this idea going into this that kind of Coruscant has this like kind of population rise up kind of thing. Like, I guess again, the Tale of Two Cities kind of being a reference here, but having Palpatine see this couple month long public array of just constant chaos and protest and rioting, and just being like, well, screw it. It worked for Jeddah. Why wouldn't it work with Coruscant? Because Coruscant's the core. And I think it would completely radicalize Luke. In this situation, though, I really wanted to take Luke and put him into a weird predicament, because he's with Orson all the time. I feel like he would know the Death Star like the back of his hand, and I don't think he'd be fully radicalized. I think he'd be pro-Empire in a way because it helped give money back to Owen and Beru, but for the most part, he wouldn't really just know that the Death Star would do that again. And I think Jeddah was small enough where he could forgive it a little bit, but believe that they wouldn't do it again. And so bombing Coruscant like that is such an insane maneuver that I think it would both radicalize Thrawn, I think it would radicalize Luke, and I think it would change the entire sequence of events, especially after Scarif. So just a different inner working of Imperial Command, taking advantage of Palpatine's kind of distrust of Tarkin before A New Hope. And yeah, so I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.